Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for inviting me. It's 5 a.m. at my end in Australia here. My name is Tsegaye Ararssa. I am an Oromo from Ethiopia. I am a lawyer by training and a law teacher by vocation. I like to call myself an independent legal scholar who is also a publicly engaged intellectual. I'm a very reluctant participant in public life, and a reluctant participant on social media. But 2014 changed everything. The Oromo protest erupted, and I was drawn into social media activism. And over time, I ended up becoming the unofficial spokesperson of the Oromo protest. And then, without my knowing, in the Amhara media networks, I was an extremist Oromo activist. I took it as a badge of honor, and I remain to be a publicly engaged public legal commentator on issues related to Ethiopia and Oromia in particular. The question, I'm not going to take a lot of time, as I always do, irrespective of my promise, but I will be only speaking to questions sent to me by Ebisa a few weeks ago. And these are three questions. And if you can, please, Ebisa, share the slides I have. Yes. So in the process of responding to the questions sent to me, I thought it's good to frame the topic as the quest for collective agency, the Oromo in a violent empire that is now granted a new afterlife. The reason I took up this title is because the questions that were sent to me is, what does the Oromo want? Okay, there are three questions, but in one or the other way, all of them simply ask, what does the Oromo want? What are the Oromo demands? What is it that Oromo is looking for at this point in time? What is it that Oromos are bringing to the table of political negotiation, if there is going to be one, towards settlement? That's basically the question. And I tried to think of what exactly it is that we need. And of course, what we demand, what Oromos as a nation demand, changes over time, it evolves, and it's dependent on the historical contingencies that it exists in. There is a diversity of interests, no question about it, as Sadala was hinting at, insisting actually a while ago. But over time, since 2018, since the revolution was hijacked, the Oromo demand has been distilled into one. The Mechu Magarsa was famous once saying during the TPLF-dominated EPRDF rule, he said, in politics in Ethiopia means different things to different people. And he said back then, to the Amhara, it's complex. To the Tigrayan, it is very simple. It is himself. To the Oromo, also it is simple, withdrawal and rejection. Not so at this point in time. Since 2014, Oromos are extremely engaged with the Ethiopian state. For a long time, the Oromo protest as a critical, loyal voice. And now, after the Oromo public has been disoriented and completely lost its agency, it has become, the question has become one. It has become more simpler, not complicated. And so the question was, what does the Oromo want? And I said, maybe, because I'm also studying the place of the Oromo in the making and breaking of Ethiopia, in the legal constitutional texts of Ethiopia, and how the constitutional legal materials have been othering Oromo in the empire. And because of that, I was looking through where we have actually failed. And for a long time, the Oromo question has been tinkered with in the form of the land question, 1974, in the form of nationalities question, 1991. We've been dealing with rights. We've been dealing with interests, but we've never dealt with power, and we've never dealt with the capacity to determine our agency. And I said, maybe maybe if you don't have that agency, that collective agency, not Oromo person's individual agency, maybe that makes sense to all the kinds of the detailed demands that we deal with. So this is the topic, and the what I was asked was what are the questions. So can you go back to the overview, please? The slides, the overview. Okay, thank you. So I will first, of course, deal with the quest, which is what does the Oromo want? What do they bring to the table? Secondly, I will talk about the Oromo hope. What do they expect to happen? What do they anticipate in the light of the current developments? And in this section, I will first try to sketch up the current developments, where we are at this point in time, and then I'll list down the major things that we expect. And finally, what are the consequences of othering, or not othering in Ebisa's words, what are the consequences of excluding Oromos from the equation that leads to a solution or a political settlement? What is the consequence of ignoring Oromos? And the answer is, in some ways, it is very simple. All the answers to all these questions. And about the demands, I can only submit a grocery list of what Oromo wants, both from the Oromo protest times and currently. But I just wanted to provoke some thoughts by talking about some of these questions. So I don't really take much time, because I basically speak to these three major questions: what Oromos want, and what they bring to the table, and then what their hope is. Now, the second slide, please. Quickly, yes. So those are the questions. What do we want? What do we expect? And what is the consequence of exclusion? And basically, I try to answer these three questions. Third slide, please. So what do we want? That's the quests. In American parlance, it's the asks. What do Oromo ask? And in my view, and I argue probably more elaborately in the full text of my remarks. And by the way, this is not an academic research paper. It is just my observation and interpretation of developments in recent years. But the full text of the remarks will be more comprehensive, and will analyze this and develop the argument. So my argument is that the Oromo wants, although it is expressed in various forms, in various terms, in various institutional frameworks, the Oromo wants at this point in time is collective agency. That is the capacity to decide on their destiny. And so it can be boiled down to one question: resolve whether the Oromo-Ethiopia relationship once and for all by conducting a referendum. And that will be the basic answer. And if you forget everything else I say, I think that's the whole point. Now, second, to elaborate on this further, you can say Oromos have been struggling for a long time, because the Oromo critique of Ethiopia always has been a loyal critique, a redemptive critique. And for that purpose, they have been arguing and fighting for social justice, recognition of equality and dignity and language, and so on and so forth. The Oromo protest movement of 2014 to 2018 was basically a demand for social justice. It was an act of loyalty, as I always said, but that was completely ignored, suppressed, and the empire is resuscitated, and the empire has struck back. And so, is it possible that the season of fighting for equality and social justice is passé? Is it possible that the season of redemption is gone? Is it possible that the bridge has been broken? Have we crossed the Rubicon? And therefore, as you know, the people, intellectual history periodizes times, and the 19th century was said to be the century of freedom, and the 20th century, they said, was going to be the century of equality. And I think in our case, the struggle of the last 60 years for a long time, in some ways, with all its varieties, was for freedom, for social justice and equality and democratization and redemption of the Ethiopian empire. Maybe a new chapter has started now. The time for freedom has come, because now freedom has been imposed. Now the demand for freedom has been imposed on Oromos at this point in time. In 2016 to 2018, Oromos have been the most loyal. I mean, Hachalu Hundessa was assassinated while singing Oromon Biyya Jara Malee Oromon Biyya Tigare. Tikkas Gabbare Guddaa Kanarra Maal Goona iyyaadha. Having said this, he was killed. And Jawar was calling for negotiation, and he was arrested. First attempted assassination and then arrested. These are typical expressions of the Oromo protest movement. These are persons that embody that season of arguing for social justice. After them, in my view, what came back? The empire struck back and said, we are going to enforce the logic of elimination embodied in the colonial settler policy. And so the elimination project has started. Destroy Oromo nationalism, kill Oromos, and break up the region and eradicate Oromoma. If this is the case, then the question becomes survival. And for effective survival, what you have to do is reassert or regain your collective agency beyond political tinkering, beyond fighting about who has a greater part in the empire or not. You know, Adwa Kenya, Balcha was the one who fought for Adwa, etc. I think that's absolutely nonsense, because at this point in time, your existence itself, you are wished out of existence in Ethiopia. So if that is the case, then it's like freedom is now imposed upon us. It has become a burden. It has become a responsibility. To fight for it has become a responsibility. And as we do, we also have to build solidarity with the others in order to create a coalition of the oppressed, the others in Ethiopia. Oromo is not the only other. And probably I argue that the united front of federalists and confederalist forces that the OLA and TDA as a nucleus started will be the future. And I chair a group, a civic group established in Virginia, Solidarity of Nations of Ethiopia. At this point in time, we try to build an alliance of the oppressed and try to forge a better future for Ethiopia, a qualitatively better future for nations and nationalities and peoples in Ethiopia who have a collective agency, and through that collective agency, renegotiate the terms of their living together if they have to. Can we move to the other slide? Yes. So that will just in a broad, in a very broad way, generally, that's what the Oromo at this point want. And I know I'm provocative. I'm being provocative, but we'll discuss that later in detail. Now, what do the Oromo expect at this point in time? And what is the present? What does the present show? The present, at this point in time, we have an empire striking back. The Ethiopian empire having an afterlife, a new one, actually. It has always had an afterlife, even after 1974, after 1991. But now it is being given a new afterlife. And there are genocidal wars, wars to eliminate people, to purify their blood, to cleanse them from the land, to clean the cities, and so on and so forth. We have genocidal wars, not just in Tigray, but also in Oromia and in various other places, including among the people of the southern people in the north, which is the Command and the Agao, and the Wollo Oromo. And we have state terrorism, sponsored vigilantes invade, conquer, and attack civilians, burn down villages, and take the herd, the cattle, and move away. And Abiy Ahmed's regime is basically giving them a wink. And you did well, because there has never been even a media news coverage. There has never been a government official who says, oh, this is bad. And in fact, Oromos are being blamed for that all the time, and the others as well. And then we have the state-sponsored hate speech, from the palace on up until media outlets and ordinary individuals in social media. The hate speech is incredible. It's almost like, unless Oromos are eliminated from this earth, this country cannot be peaceful. That's the slogan that is posted in Addis Ababa University last week. And this is where we are. And the government is not doing anything. What did the government do in response? In response, they arrested, they battered, they hit, they wounded the Oromo students. And so there is this project of unmaking federalism. Milkias was talking earlier about how the Dialogue Commission is basically engaged in the work of constitutional amendment, basically to undo the federal system, to break up the regions, to securitize identity, meaning looking at our identity as a threat to national security and re-centralizing of state power. And these are the areas identified for amendment, by the way, even by this commission, but earlier on by the Boundary Commission, which is also another unconstitutional agency. And so the present is a present of multiple crises. We've got a security crisis, war, conflict, genocide, hate propaganda, hate speech, and vigilante attacks. This is true of Oromia, this is true of Tigray, this is true of Benishangul Gumuz. This is to a certain extent was true in Wolaita, in Sidam, and on and on. So there is the security crisis, there is the humanitarian crisis. I shouldn't talk about the statistics of how many people are looking for humanitarian aid. We have a political crisis, a crisis of legitimacy being one, the narrowing down of the political space being the other, the complete enfeeblement of Oromo political parties, and the arrest and liquidation of the Oromo political leaders, to be honest. And never mind the General Assembly meetings that KFO or OFC is having at this point in time. It's a matter of survival for them. So the political crisis is deep and there. And we have the economic problem, which I'll not deal with, I'm not an economist. And then the diplomatic geopolitical crisis is there. You have Eritrea meddling in matters in Ethiopian affairs, and you have the IGAD completely in chaos. You have the entire region completely unstable. Alliances and counter-alliances are forged every day and made and broken every day, and there is that. And there is a social crisis. The social crisis is the fact that the regime basically moves, there is a forced displacement of people. There is a mass settlement in Oromia, deliberately intended to create a demographic change, especially in and around the borders and in around the cities. So it's a multiple state of crisis. Now, in this context, can we go to the other slide, please? In this context, if this is the present, then what are our asks? What are our priorities? And first and foremost, of course, as Sadala was saying, as everybody was saying, we have to end the war. The war, not just in Tigray, but in Oromia, which is just now redeclared. Just last week, Shimelis Abdisa said, we are going to have a serious engagement with Oneg Sheni, OLF, and eliminate them in 1 month. He promised that. Of course, they have pledged to do so many times. Of course, they have failed. Of course, they have said that they have eliminated OLF. But of course, they do vow in that manner. But now that they have got a respite from the northern front, which is the Tigrayan front, because they have this fake truce, they are trying to mobilize their energy to basically fight their war in Oromia. But Oromia has been in war for the last 3 years continuously. So the first responsibility, the first demand, the first thing that we engage in is to end the war. And this is done by defeating Abiy Ahmed, disarming the vigilante groups and his associates, and getting Eritrea out of our affairs. If diplomatically that can be done, that's good, but it won't, I mean, you know the limits of diplomacy these days, the international community almost doesn't exist, but it has become the fate for us to go all the way by ourselves. And so these are the tasks. And this is a gargantuan task. And then, of course, we have to restore the status quo ante. We have to settle everything politically. And then, as I said, disarm terrorizing people groups, stopping all hostilities and countering hate speech and crime, and stabilizing the region. It's very interesting that some of the sanctions in the US Senate and Congress draft bills also target basically these areas. And I think this is also, I work very closely with the Oromo Liberation Army and with the Tigray Defense Forces. I work with the in the zone, so Solidarity of Nations. I try to facilitate the work of kind of activate and pace the work of the United Front. And I see that these are basically the common demands that to stabilize the regional states, to counter hate speech, to disarm these terror groups, and restore status quo ante. Let's go back to the constitutional signboard. Let's go back to the constitutional signposts. That's basically what the asks are. Next slide. And then, because there is the humanitarian crisis, of course, we have to make sure that access is open, siege is broken, humanitarian acts are in the course of the discourse towards negotiation. I think we have to delink the humanitarian from the political, because the humanitarian is very urgent, and it is basically part of the humanitarian law, that the law of war that soldiers should obey, and it doesn't have to wait until political negotiation, political settlement is achieved. And so we have to have, even as you do your war, even as you do your politics, you have to make sure that humanitarian aid is accessible to the needy. And by the way, humanitarian crisis is not just in Tigray, in Afar, or in Amhara, as the international community tends to represent it. We have a serious humanitarian crisis in Wallo, in Wallagga, in Borana, in Arsi, in Karayu, in Guji, in Bali, and in various other places like the Somali region, the southern region, everywhere. Some of it is naturally created. Some of it is created by the war that Abiy has been fighting without the light of international media coverage in the last 3 years. And the Agao command and Wallo people of Amhara region are in the constant threat, the threat of elimination. And in fact, in the future, in the immediate future, in a post-Abiy future, one can imagine the only thing we have to do is to grant them the opportunity to establish their own local government, provisional local government, until their demand for statehood or separate identity is constitutionally verified through a referendum. And so there are a number of humanitarian issues everywhere, and that has to be done immediately without even waiting for a political settlement to happen. Shall we move on to the next one? Yes, the third ask is basically about politics and the political, averting the political crisis. And here we need to free political prisoners. We need to demilitarize politics, because what we have seen in the last 3 years is that politics has become a matter of the army. By the way, Abiy Ahmed he pretends like a civilian, but since the day he assumed power, he has been using the military. The police didn't really have any significance as it used to during the Oromo protest. It was a federal police that we were fighting against, that we were always railing against. And we, at some point when there is emergency, there was the army. And in fact, one of the questions was, take your military to the barracks. Now that language has disappeared from a political debate, because having the military do everything has become the new normal. And of course, increasingly in the last 3 years, to be an Oromo has become a crime, to be a Tigrayan has become a security threat, and therefore the two especially are securitized. That's why you have ethnic profiling, that's why you have ethnic cleansing, that's why you have all sorts of arbitrary arrest, and in some places, arbitrary execution, and making a political assassination of key leaders, and so on and so forth. So the other thing is to have an inclusive dialogue in an enlarged political space. Now, I do not expect Abiy Ahmed to be presiding over, contrary to what Sadale was saying. Opidio has said that it is not Oromo, and I have no reason to believe that they are Oromo. They have changed themselves into prosperity party precisely because they wanted to distance themselves from Oromo politics, because they don't want any politics to be done in an Oromo way. And they have never done an Oromo politics, and they have actually denounced it, politics done as Oromos. And I have no reason to say that they are Oromos. Of course, our situation is very complex and we need to heed that complexity. However, this group is not the Oromo group. And in fact, it is a terrorist group. It is a genocidal regime. It has to be put on trial, not engage in a dialogue. There is no way you can engage with a genocider. There is no way you can appease a genocider. And it has never been the case in history, and it cannot be now. And I think they cannot be part of the equation at all. There is no way Abiy Ahmed and his associates can be part of the equation. Criminals should go to jail, and an enlarged political space must be created. And in that enlarged political space, a genuine dialogue that will not put a taboo on any agenda should start. And then, of course, because there are so many outstanding, enduring, long, simmering political demands, we need to show at this point in time, if you want some better future, brighter future, we need to show a resolve, a commitment to address outstanding political demands, like the land issue in Oromia, Ababi Yumma, the right to one's own city, the right to linguistic justice, meaning having more than one language as a federal working language. There are a host of questions, and those demands, outstanding questions, to be, you have to be able to resolve, to show, to build trust, and to show. You have to show commitment that you will address them. You have to have a priority. You have to have a timeline. One of these is, for example, in the southern region alone, we have about 10 or 11 demand for statehood. And you cannot imagine a future without assuring these groups that you will be addressing their problems. Because these questions have been constitutional, they have been demanded constitutionally. Abiy Ahmed wanted to suppress them, and some of them became, in fact, went back to armed struggle. If that is the case, if you want to engage Ethiopia in the future, and if you also want to build a coalition of the oppressed or the coalition from the south, then you will have to show commitment to address these outstanding political demands. What does that mean? In simple terms, in my work with the future roadmap, I was basically saying, get a referendum act, get a provisional government, let the provisional government have a referendum act, and establish a referendum commission and set the procedure for referendum, and tell them that this will be done in your regions when it comes. And that commitment will make everyone calm. This will demilitarize the politics. People will say, okay, let's wait. And so that will be one way of dealing with it. And we put this as one of the demands of the Oromo. And then, of course, as I said earlier, the return to constitutional signposts. And by the way, Ethiopia can never be post-FDRE constitution. The empire can strike back only to lead us to crisis and genocide and warfare. There will be no post-self-determination time in Ethiopia. There will be no post-FDRE time in Ethiopia. It promises an open federal system, an association of the willing, created, rallying around the idea, the federal idea. And I do not think it is possible to turn the clock, the political clock back, and say, we can just undo this constitution and then there will be okay. No, there will be no post-FDRE moment, much to my distaste, because I've been engaged for 15 years of my academic life, critiquing that constitution, debunking it, but at least the promise stands. And since the promise stands, if you want a peaceful kind of transition in the Horn of Africa, and this is for the Westerners, I think there is no way we can steer away from the constitution, and there is no way that they can come up with a better constitution. Also, we can deal with issues that are not properly dealt with, minority rights, for example, a host of other things. But there will be no post-FDRE moment, and we need to go back to the constitutional signpost. And this can be an instrument as we go into a framework we can have in our hand as we go into negotiating or mediating between the warring groups. Next slide. This one is about the social and economic. I'm not big on this because I really don't understand. I know economic, how economic problems can be solved. It would be pretentious on my part, but I know that this mass settlement in Oromia, politically motivated and sanctioned mass mobility, the land theft. At some point, even the Opidio mayors have been saying this is a land invasion. This is not a settlement. This is not just a land grab. It is an invasion, and it was politically directed, orchestrated. And then there is this vigilante-induced eviction and destruction. So these things must stop. And of course, the ethnic profiling and all this ugly things going on should be arrested. And one thing that has come to the fore in the last 3 years, and since Abiy came to power, is the blurred relationship between church and state. And the old state religion has gone to the palace, the Daniel Kubrat, and the new Pentecostal state religion, again, because Abiy is Protestant, Pentecostal, prosperity, whatever. And so they basically storm the palace. And the consequence of that is they have this religious-oriented rail against some other groups. On the other hand, they also use religion as a card to divide people, to create other cleavages than, for example, ethno-national cleavages. And that has completely eroded the secularist principle that has been upheld in the constitution and upheld even during Mengistu's time. Since 1974, as you know, interreligious equality and secularism has been respected. And at this point in time, the Orthodox Church reasserts itself as considering itself as Ethiopia, basically, as the political body. And Abiy does his politics from the closet, the prayer closet, and he has international partners in this regard, senators and congressmen in the United States, and this has to stop. I think we need to, when we say we need to go back to constitutional signposts, one of the things that we have to once again reinvigorate is the principle of secularism in the Constitution, Article 11, the separation of state and church, and the non-interference of state in religion, religion in a state, and the recognition of religious diversity in that country, and protection of religious freedom of everyone. The other is the economy has gone military. I think last year the entire Ethiopian budget was a war budget, and the economy is basically not being managed properly at all. In fact, if it does exist, and it's important that resuscitating the economic projects, many projects that have been stalled or destroyed, stolen, etc., must be resuscitated. Next slide, please.
But just really quick, sorry to interrupt, but if you could wrap up I know you have a lot of real more dense data yet, but just in the next 5 minutes would be great.
Okay, this one. In terms of, this is again more towards the international community. And first thing we want is to get Eritrea out of the equation. And the international community in particular has to put a lot of pressure, including sanctions, on Eritrea. And also recognize this is missing in the eyes of the international community. The Oromo is basically the centerpiece of the whole. It is the least visible, and that's because it never had a collective agency. And when international media outlets report the Oromo case, it's like rebel groups in the south. It's communal violence in the south, as if there is a horizontal strife going on, and as if the big elephant in the room is not the unstable Oromia. So Oromia is the centerpiece of the whole, and you have to treat it as such. We have to treat it as such. And the Oromos should know that if you have to do diplomacy and international advocacy on the international level, then remember that this is a giant in the Horn of Africa, and make sure the connections are important to appeal to the international community also. And thirdly, Abiy has begun to turn to authoritarian regimes elsewhere, Russia, Turkey, and so on and so forth. And I think one has to interrupt this. And then there is this usual, of course, since imperial times, raid diplomacy that the Ethiopian political class has in relation to Africa. It's like these Africans, these blacks, and it's a very racial, racist statements that they make about Africa and our historic enemies, the Middle East, and so on and so forth. I think that has to be also re-evaluated. And we, of course, in good faith, we need to negotiate with Egypt, Sudan, and all the neighborhoods in the Nile in relation to the Nile. And of course, we should negotiate in the spirit of brotherhood and African fraternity, as Article 86 of the Constitution says. And next slide, and I will be done. Yes, and this one is what is the cost of what's the consequence of excluding Oromos? Well, it's the deluge, the proverbial deluge, the chaos. I mean, if you ignore Oromo and brace yourself for a non-stop chaos, war, famine, want, strife, genocide. You know why until today East Africa is the way it is? Because we couldn't get the violence out of the politics. It has been established. I mean, that area has been. Harry Reid, I think, wrote a book, States of Violence, in 2011, and he says that the East Africa, the Horn of Africa, is forged by violence and is maintained by violence. And until we deal with the violence that is ingrained into the DNA of those countries, we cannot, the politics of those countries, we cannot stabilize it. And the key and the point of departure is Oromia. And the reason these things, famine, war, want, strife, genocide recur is because of the empire. The deep state, you would say in other places, but the empire having an afterlife and always coming back to strike us, and it knows politics only violently. And so, if you ignore Oromos, then brace yourself for constant, the eternal peacelessness in the area. And it's, of course, it will result in a militarized politics. And as always, it will be a politics that securitizes identity, national ethnic identity. It will multiply the human insecurity situation in the region. It's a very ecologically fragile region, as you know, aid prone. And of course, whoever is ignoring the Oromos will lose a credible partner in the democratization process in the Horn of Africa. If you want to create a stable Horn of Africa, then you have lost a credible, without Oromos, then you have lost a credible ally, a credible partner. And probably Oromos are one of the groups that are most invested in democratization, probably unlike the other groups that go for preserving all the privileges and fight against the laws of supremacy. And there is a fear of democracy among some of them. So Oromos are invested in democracy and, of course, have the tradition of doing democratic governance. And if you leave them out, then you leave all that opportunity out. You squander the opportunity to experiment in a project of reassociating the Horn of Africa around the idea of a federal union. One other thing we will squander is the opportunity to install a lasting peace in the region. One of the reasons I say we will never have a post-FDRE moment is because the FDRE moment, for all its unimplementation, for all its dead law in the books, it basically says the project is by recognizing collective agency of the nations, which determine their destiny to create a common polity, want to create a lasting peace. And self-determination was a way of making the revolution continue and creating an open federal system that helps to disassociate and reassociate. And That process is purely legal political, which means if you want a lasting peace, that's the thing that you have to do. And last slide, please. The last question, my conclusion is only one question. And the question is, the Ethiopian state at this point in time is the sick old man of Horn of Africa. The question for us is, do we cure it? Do you want to cure it? Or do you want to bury it? In 2018, did we fail to bury it? And are we paying the consequence now? Or did we fail to cure it? And was the hope that it can be cured, that it can be redeemed? Was that a misguided one? Is a question I leave us with. Is redemption possible? And is it dangerous? 2018 shows that it is dangerous. It helped the empire to strike back. It gave the empire an afterlife. It gave actually a settler colonial logic of elimination full political energy. And so the sick old man is rising as a phoenix in arms. At some point, it was Annette Weber who used this word, referring to Ethiopia. Is Ethiopia a phoenix in arms? And that was in 2010. But now I think this sick old man, the empire, is armed and creating havoc, wreaking havoc in the region. And so as we conclude, I ask this question: as we look into the future, are we going to resurrect the sick old man, which is Abiy's project? Or are we going to work towards a union of the willing who rally around the federal idea through recovering collective agency of the oppressed and reassociating of all these coalition of the oppressed in a plurinational space forged for creating a common destiny? Is it Abiy's project, or is it the Oromo aspiration that would be a workable future for the Horn of Africa? I strongly argue that the latter is the case. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for that really in-depth presentation. I'm sorry we don't have more time to hear from you. I wish we did. I see that there are a lot of hands raised, but